Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time the stuff you sent over is,
Yeah.
wow, really powerful and honestly pretty heavy, too.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about the cycle of abuse.
Right.
We're really diving deep into this book, Breaking the Cycle of Abuse.
Yeah.
And even though it's a tough subject to, grapple with, I think it's important to remember that we're not here to judge.
Right.
It's about understanding.
Absolutely.
And hopefully, having those aha moments that can help us all make sense of these really complex patterns that can really shape lives.
Yeah, it's about, shedding light on a difficult reality and empowering ourselves and others to break free from potentially harmful cycles.
I love that word empowerment
Okay.
because it's so easy to feel kind of overwhelmed when we start talking about abuse.
Yeah.
It can feel like this invisible force that just shapes lives. And we might find ourselves asking, why do some people seem to get stuck in these patterns?
hmm
Why do they keep repeating this damaging behavior?
Yeah, and that's where understanding the roots of abuse, I think, is so crucial. And the book really emphasizes how our childhood experiences, especially early exposure to abuse or neglect, can have these really lasting consequences.
Okay, so let's unpack that for a second.
Yeah.
We've all heard the saying, hurt people, right?
Right.
But this book goes so much deeper than that.
Yeah.
And it throws out this statistic that honestly hard to wrap your head around. You ready for this?
I'm ready.
Okay, so a child who witnesses their father abusing their mother is 700 times more likely to become violent in their own life.
Yeah.
Like, wow.
It's a staggering number.
Yeah,
And it gets even worse. If that same child is also abused themselves, that likelihood jumps to 1,000 times the norm.
1,000 times.
Yeah.
I mean, it just hits you in the gut when you think about it.
Yeah.
A child, so vulnerable witnessing that kind of violence, and their little brain is literally being rewired by that experience.
Yeah.
It's no wonder that this can have such long-lasting consequences.
Well, and what's fascinating here, too, is that it's not just about physical abuse. The book carefully breaks down the different forms that abuse can take, talking about neglect, emotional abuse, psychological maltreatment, physical abuse, child sexual abuse.
Right.
Each one leaves its own kind of scars, and often these are intertwined,
Yeah.
creating even deeper wounds.
And it's not even just being directly abused.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
This is where it gets really interesting because the book points out that even just witnessing violence as a kid, even if you're not the target, can set you up for problems later on. It's like your brain is learning these unhealthy coping mechanisms, these messed up ways of dealing with conflict.
Yeah, think of it this way. Imagine a young child witnessing constant arguments, maybe even physical aggression between their parents. What are they learning?
Right.
They're learning that this is how relationships work. This is how you solve problems. And even if they're not being physically abused themselves, they're absorbing that toxic dynamic.
So they're internalizing these patterns without even realizing it.
Absolutely.
And those patterns can then play out in their own relationships later on.
Exactly. It's like these early experiences almost lay the foundation for that cycle of abuse, even if it doesn't fully manifest until much later in life.
Okay, so we've got this foundation of understanding how those early experiences can create this vulnerability to the cycle of abuse.
Right.
But the book doesn't just leave us there, right?
No.
It goes on to explore these personal risk factors that can contribute to this cycle. And it frames this in a way that I think is really helpful. It encourages us to think of this as a self-assessment, like a way to reflect on our own experiences and our potential vulnerabilities.
Right.
And it's not about blaming ourselves. It's about understanding where we might need to be extra careful, where those red flags might be.
Yeah, it's about shining a light on those blind spots.
Yeah.
The patterns that we might not even be aware of. And the book lays out some of these risk factors pretty clearly, starting, of course, with, being abused or neglected as a child.
Right.
That's often the bedrock on which this cycle is built.
Right. But it goes beyond that, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about whether you were directly abused.
It's not just about that. The book points out that witnessing abuse or violence growing up, having a family history of these patterns, even experiencing neurological or psychiatric impairments in childhood, all of these can be significant contributors.
It's like a whole web of interconnected factors
Yeah.
that can increase the risk.
Mm-hmm.
And what I find interesting is that the book doesn't shy away from getting specific. it actually delves into the profiles of both abusers and victims.
Right.
And I think that's where things get really insightful.
Well, and what's fascinating about those profiles is that they often highlight the underlying psychological mechanisms at play. For example, the book talks about how individuals who fit the profile of an abuser often struggle with things like low self-esteem,
Okay.
a need for control, difficulty empathizing, and a tendency to blame others.
Yeah.
And these are all traits that can make it easier for them to justify their abusive behavior.
So it's almost like their own internal struggles are driving them to control and dominate others.
Precisely.
Right.
And on the flip side, the profile of a victim often reveals a pattern of low self-worth, difficulty setting boundaries, and a fear of confrontation.
Okay.
And these traits can make someone more likely to tolerate abuse and even feel like they deserve it.
It's like they're trapped in this negative self-image that makes them vulnerable to being mistreated. And the book doesn't sugarcoat it. It lists specific beliefs that can make someone more susceptible to becoming a victim. Things like, I'm not good enough. I don't deserve love. It's my fault when things go wrong.
Yeah.
And these deeply ingrained beliefs can actually create a self-fulfilling prophecy, attracting those who will reinforce those negative narratives.
It's powerful stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's not just about those individual traits and beliefs.
Right.
The book also highlights those environmental factors that can contribute to this cycle of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Things like substance abuse, growing up in a misogynistic environment, experiencing high levels of stress, lacking those strong parenting skills.
Yeah.
It's like a perfect storm of factors coming together to create this fertile ground for abuse to take root.
Right.
But even with all of these risk factors, the book reminds us that it's not a life sentence.
Right.
Breaking free is possible.
Absolutely.
And that's where I think the concept of resilience comes in, which we'll definitely be exploring more deeply in a little bit.
Yes.
But before we jump into that, the book shares this real-life example that really brings home the power of these cycles.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about the story of Nina, right?
Exactly. Nina's family tree reveals this heartbreaking pattern of intergenerational sexual abuse spanning generations.
Oh.
It shows just how deeply rooted these cycles can be
Yeah.
and how important it is to break free.
It's a reminder that this isn't just an individual struggle.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that can permeate families,
Absolutely.
communities.
A whole community.
And it highlights why understanding these patterns is so crucial. The sooner we can recognize them,
Yes.
the sooner we can start to dismantle them.
And that recognition starts with understanding our own vulnerabilities, our own risk factors, and the ways in which those early experiences might be shaping our behavior today.
It's about taking ownership of our past, acknowledging the wounds, and then taking those first steps toward healing and breaking free.
And speaking of those first steps towards healing, the book kind of shifts gears in a really interesting way. It moves from this heavy analysis of risk factors to a message of hope. And it really focuses on this idea of resilience.
Resilience.
Yeah.
It's almost like a superpower, isn't it?
Yeah.
This ability to bounce back from adversity, to thrive even in the face of challenges. But it's not something you're just born with.
Right. That's the beauty of it. Resilience can be cultivated, nurtured, even learned.
Right.
It's not about erasing the past, but about developing the strength and the skills to move forward in a healthy way. And the book lays out some really practical steps for building resilience, starting with the power of positive role models.
That makes so much sense. When you've been surrounded by negativity and unhealthy patterns, having someone to show you a different way of being, a different way of relating to others can be totally life-changing.
Think about it. If you've never witnessed healthy conflict resolution, if you've never seen someone stand up for themselves in a respectful way, it's hard to even imagine what that looks like.
Right.
But having that positive role model can give you a glimpse of that possibility,
Yeah.
a blueprint for building healthier relationships.
Like they're showing you, hey, this is how it's done. This is how you can break free from those old patterns.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about those external role models.
Right.
The book also emphasizes the importance of developing strong self-esteem and self-efficacy.
Okay, so self-esteem, I get it. It's about liking yourself,
Yeah.
valuing yourself.
Right.
But self-efficacy, that's a little more nuanced, isn't it?
Yeah, self-efficacy is about believing in